Conversation with the Candidate continues.
Thank you for clicking on our extended digital conversation with the candidate with former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld. We have 30 minutes commercial free here. We're going to get to as many questions as we possibly can, and we're going to start with Brennan Robinson.
Hi, Governor Weld.
Evening.
I actually voted for you in 2016.
Excellent.
Glad that you're on the top of the ticket now.
Great.
My question was, how will you bring dignity, honesty, transparency, and all that jazz back to the White House? It seems like there's been a bit of that lacking lately.
No, I would agree with that. I think that kindness and decency are the elements that I find most tragically missing in this administration. And the touchstone going in was let's make everyone feel terrible about immigrants and essentially make everyone hate people from other countries and other religions. And that's the opposite of my view, which is we want to be inclusive of everybody. I think you got to lead by example and act with dignity and not to put too fine a point on it, but not act inappropriately towards women throughout your life. I mean, the guy who's now in there, it may not be entirely his fault. He really didn't have preparation to be president. He was basically, a wealthy socialite from New York and Palm Beach whose job was to judge beauty contests. Now, a man who puts himself forth as his profession being a judge of beauty contests, I know what kind of man that is. And it's not someone who's thinking about how to act with dignity and respect and restraint all the time. So in addition to setting a role model, as I think almost all of our presidents have done to maintain the dignity of the office, I think your philosophy of government can show that you care about everybody, that you don't want anyone to be left behind. And my view of democracy is that its essence is that the individual shall never be thrust in a corner. And that's why I ran on the ticket I did 3 years ago, the emphasis on the rights of the individual as opposed to government. I'm a small government guy. But I think if you keep that in mind, it means you don't want people to be, fearing the police siren and living in the shadows. Those are the two worst things that can happen in a democracy.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Brennan. Our next question comes from Joan Krimlisk.
Hello, Governor Weld.
Yes, ma'am.
What can be done to be more secure at ports for people, drivers, and cargo crossing borders?
At ports of entry?
Yeah, so airports, land ports, and seaports.
Well, I presided over Logan Airport and the Mass Port Authority. We were one of the airports targeted by Osama bin Laden, so don't think we didn't put in maximum security measures. One of my daughters worked for Ray Kelly, the New York Police Commissioner, in the counterterrorism squad, so I'm familiar with what he did in New York. And Ray Kelly had as many people on that job as the FBI. He had 2,000 people on the counterterrorism front, and he kept New York City safe. And New York, of course, had been the magnet, first in 1993 with the failed attempt at the World Trade Center, and then with the successful attempt in 2001 with the hijacked airplanes. So I think he did an exemplary job of keeping everybody safe against a lot of odds. The first Homeland Security Secretary, who I overlapped with as governor, Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania, absolutely nothing happened on his watch. Michael Chertoff after him, same thing. So I would go talk to those two folks right away and say, tell me everything you did. But I'm in discussion now with intelligence and national security officials in Washington who want to make sure that all the candidates are briefed on those issues so that the president doesn't have the only window on those issues. And I'm listening carefully to them as well.
Quick follow-up question there. Would torture be on the table in terms of counterterror as a policy?
No, it wouldn't. I never understood why we didn't join the Convention Against Torture. The United States has refused to join that treaty. And when I was in the criminal division, I never understood why. And people would explain to me, and it just sounded like gobbledygook to me. It was something about our national sovereignty. Our national sovereignty does not extend to torturing people.
Our next question comes from Clara Monier.
Yes. Good evening, Governor. There have been a number of articles about Social Security running into problems by 2035. Have you thought about solutions, and what are they?
Yeah, no, I've thought a lot about that, and that's where the debt issue comes in. I mean, I fear that unless we address the deficit, that Social Security is going to be under enormous pressure. You know, the polls that have been done of millennials show that by and large they don't think that they're going to receive Social Security when they reach that age. And unless we address the deficit, they're probably right about that. You know, around the edges, retirement age, means testing. I'm not sure any of those suggestions really is going to shore up the system. So another suggestion is having people who have a lot of money contribute more into the system. That might be worth some merit, but I would look at all those. But I think the bottom line issue is reckless spending in Washington.
Thank you, Claire. Governor, if you don't mind, what are some other entitlement reform ideas that you have that you could put into place that you feel would attack the deficit and the national debt?
Well, again, I like more emphasis on the individual. So I'd like individuals to be able to have, as they already do to an extent, individual retirement accounts. And so you have an IRA, a Keogh, a Roth plan, but I'd allow people to save as much in a tax-advantaged manner, meaning tax-free when you take it out, as possible, so they can plan for themselves what they think their own needs in retirement are going to be. In the health area, I think people should be able to have health savings accounts that they can sock money away into in a tax-free measure, because not everybody wants a Cadillac. One minor cavil I have with the Affordable Care Act is it kind of says one size fits all, and we want to mandate that everybody gets coverage for everything, so everybody gets a Cadillac. Well, it's nice if everybody can have a Cadillac, but it's also expensive. And maybe not everyone wants a Cadillac. I always buy insurance with high deductibles because I don't want to be covered down to the ground, because I know it'll be cheaper if I have a high deductible. Other people might feel the same way. So I would experiment with health savings accounts to put the most powerful tools in the hands of the individual who can make their own decisions about what they wanted. And that's a root and branch approach to entitlements, because entitlements by definition is the government saying this is the way it's going to be for everybody. And I'm not so sure about those one-size-fits-all solutions.
What about people who can't afford to save?
Well, you make adjustments for that. I think all the time about families living right at the poverty level who are stretching, and they can't quit their job because then they lose their benefits. But they can't. The marginal dollar, they can't spend it on something that's a luxury because it's going for food for their kids. And if we don't make steps for them to be able to have the jobs of the future, the replacement jobs that kick in after artificial intelligence and robotics and drones and self-driving vehicles have robbed us of a lot of the existing jobs. If we don't do that, then the door to the middle class is going to be slammed in the face of the working poor. And those are people I think about all the time. And in designing a jobs program for the United States, which is something that would be very high on my agenda, the best social program anybody ever invented is a job, because again, that's putting power in the hands of the individual and making the individual self-reliant and able to care for his or her family. I would be concentrating on those people who were working hard but can't make it without a little bit of a boost. When I was in office in Massachusetts, I worked several times on greatly increasing the earned income tax credit, which it's not quite a negative income tax, but it puts money in the pockets of people who are working hard and just can't quite make it for themselves and their children.
We have a Facebook question coming in from Lauren Selig. It's about gun control. She asks, to quote my 8th grader, quote, "Should the people deciding my future choose you to be our president, what will you do to help make sure I am not gunned down before I graduate high school?" The mother asks, as her mother, I'd like to know what you plan to do not only to address gun violence, but also mental health issues.
Yeah, well, they're not unrelated. And I think the bottom line is we have to keep weapons of all kinds. There are no weapons that aren't dangerous, almost by definition. So you got to keep all weapons out of the hands of people who are dangerous. And, you know, take Sandy Hook, the worst of them all in my book. That totally was caused because someone wanted to put guns, weapons in the hands of somebody who was clearly mentally unstable to improve his self-confidence. What a tragedy. You know, and those schoolrooms with not a sound coming out of them after the first 6 minutes. I can't get that one out of my head. So I'd be prepared to be quite aggressive in terms of keeping all guns, not just, you know, guns that scare people because they got a tripod, all guns out of the hands of people who have mental health issues or instability issues. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I don't think you get anywhere by saying, you know, there's 300 million rifles out in the United States now in private ownership, all legally acquired. We're gonna outlaw the ones that we don't like the look of. You know, that would, again, that would not be good in terms of the relationship between the government and the citizens. And actually, and this will be controversial, but if you look through history, when regimes have absolutely taken guns away from everybody, it's often a prelude to genocide. Hitler did it, made it almost impossible for Jews to own weapons. Boom. The Jews have no defense when Hitler comes for them. Stalin in Russia, even worse, even more people slaughtered. But it's not just the two big ones. Idi Amin in Uganda outlawed firearms and promptly slaughtered all his political opponents. So, you know, I used to think about guns because I've been a lifelong hunter as something that we need to protect for hunting. It's not hunting, it's self-defense. And it may sound crazy in the United States because we've had this glorious tradition and we're also safe and we have a super society and we're first world. It's not so fanciful, I don't think, if you look at history. So that's on the other side.
Our next question comes from Dan Bergeron.
Governor, another big important question for you. Do you support school choice?
Well, that's kind of an easy one. I made my career supporting school choice and charter schools, and the only time I testified on a bill in the Massachusetts legislature where the crowd was behind me was on school choice and charter schools. And I was talking to the heads of the education committee in the legislature who were strongly supported by the teachers union, who of course didn't want any of that. And I said, well, this is my position. And they were nervous. And the reason they were nervous is because there were 300 people sitting behind me and there was not a white face in the room. It was all black parents who knew that their kids were trapped in failing inner city schools and they didn't have any choice. So that's been my mantra right along. We did, in 1993, enact a major education reform bill in Massachusetts, and I made kind of a grand bargain with the Democrats in the legislature. I said, I'm willing to put $7 billion more into K through 12 education if you'll give me some management give back so we'll have high stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 10th grade. So we'll get some accountability into the system. No more social promotions. No more saying you get to the end of the year, you automatically go to the next grade. Well, that's what the teachers union wanted, so they wouldn't have any trouble then. And someone finishes 12 years in school, they go on to college, even if they're totally unprepared for it. So Massachusetts have been a little bit below the middle of the pack until then. After that reform, Massachusetts was #1 in reading and mathematics on standardized tests every year for the next 25 years up until this year. So I'm pretty sure that's the way to go in education. And I think a lot of what U.S. Department of Education does is interference with parental and local control.
Well, thank you for your perspective.
Thank you, Dan. And following up on the Department of Education, you hear a lot of Republicans talk about abolishing that department. Is that something that you would consider if you're the president?
Yes, it most certainly is. I mean, they do some things that would have to be replaced. They educate Americans abroad, and but I'd want to cherry pick what they absolutely have to do and preserve that and maybe have it be done by a renamed department. But I think we need, and I'm kind of way conservative on education. I think we need school choice. I think we need charter schools. I think we need homeschooling. We need less federal interference. I'm a big 10th Amendment man. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that the powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And I think of education as something where you really do want the local authorities and the parents to have a bigger say in it than they do if the rules are coming down from Washington. So I'd take a good look at that U.S. Department of Education. It was created when Jimmy Carter made a deal with the National Education Association at the 1976 nominating convention. And he said, you're going to have this department, and something like 2/3 of the delegates to the convention were members of the NEA or the other national teachers organizations. So that's how it was born, and I don't think it's lived up to its promise.
So to what extent should the government ensure the quality of the charter schools or the independent schools that are outside of the public schools?
It should ensure the quality. And one thing that we made a point of in Massachusetts, even though we were wildly in favor of charter schools to introduce creativity into the school, the education process at K through 12, I always made it a point of saying that charter schools have to have freedom to fail. They can't have an invisible government safety net underneath them. And 5 or 6 of them, even in my time, did fail because they didn't get the job done. And that's part of the Education Reform Act. Is if there are schools which are failing, the bottom 10% of schools get kind of warning letters in Massachusetts. And if they don't shape up, then the ultimate remedy is to place them into receivership, and nobody wants that. But we created incentives to put pressure on the principals, and the principal is the key actor in a school situation to deliver quality, or else. That's what I mean by accountability, and Massachusetts has profited by that in the last 25 years.
Another social media question, this one coming from Facebook. Julie Sims asks, what is your stance on abortion?
I've always been pro-choice. Half my voters in Massachusetts have been pro-choice and half have been pro-life. I never rub anybody's nose in that. Again, just as, except for, Planned Parenthood folks who supported me, I never knew whether members of my cabinet or people working with me were pro-choice or pro-life. I do see both sides of that issue. My wife and I had that issue come up once where one of our kids, it was not a problem pregnancy, but there was an issue creating risk, and there was some suggestion from the doctors and the medical people handling the case that maybe we should consider terminating the pregnancy. And we said, are you kidding? And the reason for that is that we didn't want them making that decision, and we wanted to make that decision, and that's the basis for my long-time held pro-choice position. Is I don't want a bunch of big fat white guys in Congress making a decision as to what a woman's going to do with her body.
Our next question comes from Becca Budrock.
Hi, Governor Weld. Thank you for being in New Hampshire today.
Thank you. I enjoy it.
I'm an environmental science student, so you can imagine that environmental issues are really near and dear to my heart. So my question for you today is, what are your plans to increase the availability of local food across the country?
Local?
Local food.
Oh, local food as in vegetables and, yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I'm a pluralist. I believe in variety. I may be on the wrong side of the GMO issue for you. I think GMO is okay because it creates a lot more food to be distributed to populations, mainly around the world, not in the United States, that need it. But as you probably know, the capital of hydroponic vegetables is in The Hague in Holland, and we import their measures, just as in animal husbandry. The United States is the capital, headquartered in the state of Texas. But I do think that hydroponic methods of growing vegetables and other vegetation could be employed more in the United States than they are now. The technology is centered in Western Europe, and we should bring more of that in. But I spend a lot of time in the country, upstate New York, up here, and always patronize the local food outlets.
Thank you, Becca.
Thank you.
I would say one other thing. I think that I've spent a lot of time focusing on the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which were passed within my lifetime in the early 70s, and brought the suit to clean up Boston Harbor in the 80s. So I've had a long-standing interest here, and the Rivers Protection Act in Massachusetts as well. So a lot of this reduces to water, and if you don't protect the water supplies and the water table, then you get big issues down the line with food as well. So that's a high priority of mine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Becca. And following on that, It's not exactly the headline department in the cabinet, but what would change at the Department of Agriculture in a Weld administration?
Oh, you know, I hadn't thought a great deal about that.
There's certainly a lot of subsidy there that
Yeah.
between corn in Iowa and whatnot, and certainly we see a lot with the tariffs going on.
I probably would be enough of a conservative to take a good look at all those subsidies, but it's not an area that I've become expert in. I think by and large the department does a pretty good job. Some people who are controversial, Earl Butz comes to mind, was a damn good Secretary of Agriculture, so it helps to come from that area, that neck of the woods, and know the issues cold.
Okay, another social media question, this one coming from John Ferrant. He asks, what is your plan to combat the opioid crisis?
Well, that's a tough one. I've buried two young men in the last couple of years, 20 years of age and 21 years of age. One of them was my godson. You know, when I was in the Justice Department for 7 years, did a lot in enforcement. Obviously, what's going on now is that fentanyl and other contaminants are getting into the opioids, among other things. My successor as governor, Charlie Baker, who's the current governor of Massachusetts and was my Secretary of Finance and my Secretary of Health and Human Services, has developed a comprehensive program to combat opioid abuse, and he brought in the doctors and the healthcare industry and said, look, we're going to have to put the wood to you, and docs, you can't prescribe as much as you want because, you know, just because it goes into your pocket, and we got to have these rules. And he had all the stakeholders in the table, and I think most people think that his program that he worked out should be, like my welfare program, a model for the national government. So the first place I would go is Charlie Baker and Karen Polito, who's the lieutenant governor there, and just steep myself in what they've developed.
With your criminal justice background, so much of what we see now in the opioid crisis is this shift to treating it as a public health problem. Where do you draw the line between criminal behavior and what is essentially the act of someone who is addicted and stuck in that addiction?
As part of criminal justice reform, which is currently under consideration and partly was passed, the first step legislation that passed in Congress recently, I think we should be moving in the direction of classifying more things as a national public health emergency and less as a criminal justice priority. And that would apply to addiction as well. And in the area of narcotics enforcement, for example, I've spent some time with the organization called Facing Addiction. And I do think that addiction of all kinds, whether it's alcohol or narcotics, it's a public health emergency. And yet, many times, particularly with narcotics addiction, the first reaction of law enforcement has been, here's a law enforcement priority. I'm not sure that isn't penny wise and pound foolish. I'm not sure that that's a condition that's entirely voluntary. So I'd be on the side of treating more of those things as national health emergencies. In the area of narcotics enforcement, I've gotten more familiar recently with the cannabis industry and marijuana, and I can tell you that there's a huge social justice issue there in that if you're black and not white, you're 4 times as likely to get arrested for cannabis possession, not dealing, but possession, as if you're white. And you're 4 times as likely to get a jail sentence than if you're white. And the jail sentence is likely to be 4 times as long as if you're white. So you're behind the cheap seats by a factor of 64. That's really too big a disparity to be based on race alone. So I think we got some rethinking to do in this area.
This may be diving pretty deep into the memory banks, but can you think of anyone you prosecuted in the 1980s that falls under that sort of umbrella of a drug offender only, that perhaps the book was thrown at them and it may not have been just looking back?
Not by name, but and I did try to steer DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, away from the 2-ounce buy-bust cases where they could catch somebody in the street, get credit for a statistic, and in favor of the big rings. I told all my assistant U.S. attorneys we should develop cases, not that the DA could do, because we were federal, but we had many more tools at our disposal, including the investigative agencies and a broader jurisdiction, mail fraud, wire fraud, firearms jurisdiction. So we should bring cases that will be brought if we weren't here. So it shouldn't be the guy on the street with 2 ounces of coke. It should be the mastermind who's not even in the United States. But we have worldwide venue and jurisdiction, so we didn't have to worry about that. A DA would get stopped at the state line. So we tried to focus, I tried to focus our people on the great big cases, but there were still some buy-bust cases prosecuted, and I'm sure if I had the opportunity to go back and revisit the Pross memos on all of those, I might say, not worth our trouble. You know, sometimes you're bringing a case to keep peace with the investigative agency, but maybe that rule could have been drawn a little bit more brightly.
Another social media question, this one coming from Dennis Shea Jr. Will you deport all illegal aliens in the country and prosecute any government official aiding them?
Deport all illegal aliens? Well, no, I'm not sure I would. You know, a lot of the undocumented aliens that are now in the country just overstayed their work visas. I happen to think we need more work visas in this country, a lot less, for a couple of reasons. If you ask any state governor, Texas or West, whether the agriculture and construction industries in the western part of the United States could be fully taken care of without the in-migration from the south through the Mexican border, and that would be Central Americans, not just Mexicans, they would say no. We need that human power to make those industries work. And people don't like to focus on that, but it's true. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is we have the best graduate schools in the world. So we're educating the best and the brightest. A lot of them are from Asia. They're foreigners. They're immigrants, if you will. And so when they get their PhD from our glittering institutions, many of them in Massachusetts, we say, okay, bye-bye, back to China. So we're just educating our competition. And if we, you know, had more work visas, made it a little bit easier for those people to stick around and work on our side of the football, I think that would be good as well. I think the hysteria that President Trump has built up about immigration, and, you know, he says of the Mexicans, they're all murderers and rapists. Well, as someone who's nominated to be ambassador to Mexico and who chose Mexico over the Court of St. James in England and New Delhi in India, I don't share that view. And I think it's all politics. You know, the president has a one-word program for the environment and climate change: hoax. He has a one-word program for immigration: wall. Very easy to understand, but they're not even slogans. They're just scare words, and I don't buy it.
Former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, we thank you for joining us
Adam.
for Conversation with the Candidate. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our
Thank
studio
you, everybody.
audience of Town Hall voters. We appreciate you very much. We're going to have next week Governor John Hickenlooper. Oh, you want to say one more thing?
Let me say one thing to the audience. You know, I'm seldom nervous when I'm speaking in public, and I'm not now. But I understand you're all undecided voters. So if I was ever going to be nervous, it would be in front of you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the governor. Thank you to you watching at home and watching this digital conversation. Next week, John Hickenlooper. Until then, have a good evening.
Okay. Thanks again, Adam.
All right. Go ahead and shake hands with folks here, too.
Hey,
Get to meet the
everybody.
public.
You know what the Beatles said? You're such a lovely audience, we'd like to take you home with us. Thanks for the question.